He never saw the gun coming. Not in the way a man who has faced war expects danger, because war has rules even when it pretends it doesn't. But here, in his own hometown, with his prosthetic leg clicking quietly against the convenience store floor, Malcolm Turner was met with a level of disrespect so sharp it felt like the air itself split open before the explosion of the first shot. A shot that came without a warning, without a command, without any reasonable cause. A shot driven not by fear but by a hatred that had been sitting in the heart of Officer Ethan Caldwell for years, growing like rust under paint. And when that trigger snapped, it was like every moment Malcolm had fought to build a life of peace after the military was ripped away from him in an instant, his body jerking backward as the bullet tore into his chest. Then again, and then again, the sound echoing in a way that didn't feel real, as if the world around him paused. The clerk screamed. Someone outside dropped their drink. And Malcolm's mind went not to pain or confusion, but to the face of his son, Isaiah, the child who depended on him, the reason he woke up each morning, the reason he stayed strong through the nightmares, and in those seconds as he collapsed to the floor with blood soaking through his shirt. He wondered not if he would die, but how his son would survive without him, how his boy would make sense of a world that would do this to a man who had already given so much of himself in service overseas, a man who had taken bullets defending a country that in this moment did not defend him back. Before going into the story you are watching, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and leave a like, because your support helps these stories reach more people who need to hear them, and it keeps this community growing strong. Malcolm Turner had not planned for the morning to be anything more than a stop for a coffee and a simple breakfast sandwich, the kind his son liked before baseball camp. And he moved with a steady calm that came from years of discipline, from training, from learning to breathe through the pain of memories that were too heavy to speak aloud. And yet, even with all that strength, Malcolm remained gentle because he had decided long ago that the world already had enough men who used force to prove themselves. The clerk behind the counter, a young woman barely out of college named Kayla, recognized Malcolm as a regular, someone polite, someone who always said thank you, someone who joked about needing stronger coffee to keep up with kids who never seemed to run out of energy. And she smiled when she saw him that morning, unaware that in just a few minutes her hands would be shaking so violently she could barely hold her phone. Officer Ethan Caldwell entered the store not because there was a crime, not because someone called for help, but because he had seen Malcolm's truck at the pump and the bias inside him had taken over the way a sudden storm takes a summer sky. Without reason, without hesitation, fueled by something deep and unspoken and ugly. He walked straight toward Malcolm, chest forward, chin raised, the tone of authority sharpened just enough to send a message without words. And he asked the kind of question that didn't need to be asked, the kind meant to put a man in his place. "What are you doing here?" Malcolm answered simply, calmly, because a man who has survived combat does not get rattled by a raised voice. But calmness was not what Caldwell wanted, and when Malcolm reminded him politely that he had the right to move freely, to buy coffee like anyone else, Caldwell's expression shifted into something cold, a challenge, a dare. He demanded to search Malcolm with no cause, and Malcolm, who had spent years teaching his son about dignity and rights and standing firm in the truth without anger, said no, clear and steady, and that refusal, that simple moment of strength, was enough to pull the gun from Caldwell's holster. Kayla saw his hand move before Malcolm did, and her breath caught in her throat because there was no need, no threat, no escalation, just a man wanting to show power. And she scrambled for her phone even as the first shot rang out. Malcolm fell hard, his prosthetic leg twisting beneath him, his body heavy, his vision flickering. And yet through the haze of pain and fear and shock, he held on to one thought, the image of Isaiah on the baseball field, smiling at him from the pitcher's mound. Kayla didn't think. She just recorded, her voice trembling, her breathing uneven, but her hands steady enough to capture the truth. The shots, the silence, the officer's cold voice calling in a fabricated report, claiming Malcolm attacked him. That recording would not stay in that store. It would travel. Quietly, at first, then rapidly, landing in the hands of people who would not let this moment disappear into excuses or reports or silence. People who knew Malcolm not as a statistic, but as a brother, a teammate, a man who had risked his life to protect others. And while Malcolm lay on that tile floor, blood seeping outward like a stain the world could no longer ignore. The story we are about to follow began with a choice. The choice of a young woman to press record, and the choice of a group of former soldiers, bound by loyalty and love, to answer the call that came to them in the form of one single haunting audio clip. When the recording left Kayla's trembling hands, it moved like a quiet ripple across the country, passing from one person to another until it reached a man sitting in an office in Chicago. A man who froze when he heard Malcolm's voice strained in pain on the floor of that gas station. Because that voice belonged to someone who once pulled him from the wreckage of a burning Humvee in Somalia years ago. Someone who had laughed in the face of death to save him. And that man was Captain Isaiah Brooks, the leader of the Nighthawks. Isaiah was in the middle of a routine briefing for a corporate security client when the message came through. Just a short audio file attached to a text that read, "Only. It's Malcolm." Isaiah excused himself from the room, walked out to the hallway, and listened with his back pressed against the wall, eyes closed, hand slowly rising to cover his mouth as he heard those gunshots. Heard the officer yelling a false command that had never been spoken before the shots were fired. Heard Malcolm's body hit the floor. In that moment, he did not think about contracts, deadlines, or schedules. He thought of Malcolm's son, Isaiah Jr., only 11 years old, full of hope. He thought of Malcolm's promise to be better than the violence he came from, without hesitation. Isaiah called the Nighthawks. Amara Coleman was on a training range in San Diego, walking corporate clients through how to respond to active threats without panic. And the sound of Malcolm's strained breathing in that recording hit her like a slap to the chest. She didn't ask questions, didn't request details. She simply said, when and where. Darius King, in Atlanta, was teaching a group of teenagers wilderness navigation, telling them about strength that doesn't require aggression. When his phone vibrated, he listened with his hand on his knee, eyes low, breath deep and controlled like a man containing fire. Lena Ortiz, in Houston, was finishing a night shift in the ER, hands still smelling of disinfectant and adrenaline, exhaustion heavy in her bones. But when she heard Malcolm struggling to breathe, she was already grabbing her bag, and Noah Patel, the one Nighthawk who still lived in Memphis, was just 3 miles away from the hospital where Malcolm was taken. And when he heard the recording, guilt hit him harder than grief, because he had always believed if Malcolm ever needed him, he would be close enough to step in. 6 hours after the shooting, an old warehouse just outside downtown Memphis became a quiet gathering place, not marked by flags or signs or uniforms, but by the weight of shared history and loyalty that ran deeper than blood. Isaiah arrived first, eyes focused, face stern but not hard, a man carrying responsibility like armor. Amara came next, setting up her equipment without speaking, her movements sharp, efficient. Darius arrived with supplies and the look of a man who has survived too much to be shocked, yet still hurt by injustice. Lena came straight from the hospital, still wearing scrubs, hands shaking, eyes red. Noah entered last, shoulders heavy, and when he said, "He's critical, but alive." The room exhaled as one. They didn't shout, they didn't panic. They created a plan. Amara's first move was digital. She traced the gas station security system and confirmed the footage had been accessed and edited. meaning someone was already working to cover Caldwell's actions. Lena explained Malcolm's condition: 3 bullets, 1 punctured lung, 1 fractured rib. Surgery completed, but another required, and he would need time, rest, safety. Darius worked through the tactical map of the city, noting choke points, likely police patrol patterns, and the neighborhoods the sentinels targeted. Noah explained what most outsiders didn't understand. This wasn't just one bad officer. This was an organized pattern, coordinated pressures on black-owned properties, arrests without cause, intimidation, a slow squeeze to push people out so developers could move in. The Nighthawks listened with quiet fury, the kind that did not burn out of control but focused, precise. They knew what had to be done. The first step was the truth. They had Kayla's audio recording, but they needed the visual proof to stand against Caldwell's report. Amara began retrieving the raw data from the station's hard drive remotely, piece by piece, even corrupted fragments, because she believed no deletion was ever truly permanent. Isaiah reached out to a trusted contact in local media, Jasmine Reed, a journalist known not for sensational headlines, but for exposing difficult truths. She replied within minutes, agreeing to meet that evening at a small coffee shop downtown. Meanwhile, Caldwell issued a report stating Malcolm had lunged at him, that he feared for his life, a line so familiar it felt rehearsed, a poem passed down through generations of excuses. The police chief, Ronald Harper, supported Caldwell immediately, praising his courage in a dangerous situation. And local news stations repeated the statement almost word for word. But the Nighthawks had seen too much, lost too much, to allow the truth to be buried under official language. And as the sun lowered that evening, in a quiet warehouse lit by hanging bulbs and the blue glow of laptop screens, something unspoken passed through the group. This was not revenge. This was correction. This was protection. This was the moment they would stand not just for Malcolm, but for every person whose story had been silenced before it could be heard. The warehouse became a quiet command center, not loud or chaotic like scenes shown in movies, but steady, deliberate, filled with the weight of men and women who had already lived through the worst of human nature and still chose to stand against it again. Amara sat at the folding table with her laptop open, screens reflecting in her eyes as she sifted through corrupted footage fragments pulled from the gas station's security system. Each recovered frame a small victory in the fight for truth. Bits and pieces appeared first. Malcolm entering the store with his usual calm posture. No aggression, no tension, just a man buying breakfast for his child. Caldwell walking in seconds later, his jaw stiff, his body angled in that subtle posture of intimidation. And then the critical frame showing Caldwell reaching up to tap his body camera just before the confrontation escalated, muting it on purpose. That single action, captured from a far corner camera that Caldwell had forgotten existed, was enough to prove intent. Noah stood behind Amara, arms crossed, still wearing his security guard uniform, jaw set as if holding anger in place so it would not spill out where it could get someone hurt. Across the warehouse, Kayla entered cautiously, her hands clasped tight, shoulders trembling just slightly, still processing the shock of having witnessed something that would change her life. But she walked toward the Nighthawks anyway, because courage is often quiet and shaky and shows itself in forward steps rather than loud declarations. Isaiah greeted her gently, his voice low, steady, appreciating not only the recording, but her willingness to stand for truth when it was frightening to do so. She described everything again, slowly, clearly, reliving it while the others listened with a seriousness that told her she was believed without question. When she finished, there was a moment of silence in the room, the kind that comes when everyone understands the weight of what has been shared. Meanwhile, Lena called from the hospital with an update on Malcolm. He had made it through the night, still unconscious, still on oxygen support, and the doctors planned another procedure to stabilize internal bleeding. But there was hope. Fragile, but real. The news steadied the Nighthawks, reminded them why they were here. Isaiah, Darius, and Noah began gathering information on Officer Ethan Caldwell's history, his past complaints, his disciplinary records, and what they found confirmed what Noah had suspected. Caldwell had been involved in at least 6 prior incidents labeled resisting arrest or failure to comply, all involving black residents in neighborhoods targeted for redevelopment. Each incident conveniently resulted in property damage, police citations, or arrests that forced families out, allowing the land to be sold cheaply to Memphis Future LLC, the real estate development company led by Vincent Russo. The Nighthawks didn't work in guesswork or rumors. They needed solid proof. So Amara retrieved archived police dispatch recordings and older internal car camera audio logs. She found something in Caldwell's patrol car system, tucked deep under metadata folders, a clip from 2 months earlier where Caldwell had radioed Chief Ronald Harper, saying, "I've got another one. Should be able to clear this block by next week." The tone was casual, like talking about removing debris, not people. Isaiah's face hardened as they listened, because this was no misunderstanding or heat-of-the-moment decision. This was systematic targeting, planned and executed like operations. Jasmine Reed arrived at the warehouse later that afternoon, wearing plain clothes and carrying a notebook instead of a camera. Her expression firm but not hardened. A woman who knew danger but refused to let fear decide her actions. She listened carefully as the Nighthawks laid out what they had uncovered, and she revealed her own files, documents connecting Russo and Councilwoman Diane Weaver through campaign contributions, private land sales, and delayed public development announcements. The Sentinels, the name whispered in neighborhoods but never spoken officially, were the enforcement arm of that plan. Isaiah asked Jasmine to proceed carefully, not to publish yet, not until they had secured Malcolm and Kayla, not until they had footage, audio, testimony, and unbreakable evidence. Jasmine agreed, understanding that timing could be the difference between justice and a quiet burial of the story. As dusk approached, Noah drove Kayla back to her apartment to ensure her safety, and they arrived just in time to see Officer Caldwell standing near her building door, his posture stiff and his face carrying a tension that suggested fear disguised as authority. He tried to speak to Kayla, voice low and persuasive, telling her she had misunderstood what happened, that things were more complicated, that talking to the wrong people could ruin lives. But before he could attempt intimidation, Noah stepped between them, calm but immovable, recording the entire interaction with a handheld camera, capturing Caldwell's tone, his insistence that Kayla reconsider what she thought she heard. That recording would soon join the others as another piece of truth. Caldwell walked away with clenched fists and the first clear sign of panic in his eyes, realizing control was slipping. Back at the warehouse, Amara finally restored enough footage to show not only the shooting, but also the exact moment Caldwell deactivated his camera and stepped toward Malcolm aggressively, proving false narrative beyond doubt. The Nighthawks reconvened around the screen, each watching quietly, anger building not as fire, but as something steadier, resolve. They were not acting out of vengeance. They were building a case. They were preparing to expose an entire system that had counted on silence. And while Malcolm still lay unconscious in the hospital, surrounded by machines and the quiet hope of survival, the people who loved him were already moving, already preparing, already ensuring that when he opened his eyes again, he would not wake to a world that allowed his suffering to be ignored. Evenings settled over Memphis not with peace, but with a heavy quiet that felt like the city was holding its breath. waiting for something it could not yet name. And inside, Grind City Coffee, a small local shop with soft lighting and worn wooden tables. The Nighthawks met with Jasmine Reed to plan their next step. Jasmine arrived with a manila folder tucked under her arm, her expression focused, a quiet determination in her eyes that had been shaped by years of witnessing injustices ignored and stories buried because truth did not always serve those in power. She placed the folder on the table and opened it slowly, revealing printouts of financial records, emails, and internal memos connecting Councilwoman Diane Weaver to Vincent Russo, the CEO of Memphis Future LLC, with transaction patterns that aligned disturbingly well with neighborhoods where the Sentinels had made arrests or used force. Jasmine explained calmly, her voice even, that she had been following Russo for over a year, suspecting corruption but unable to link it directly to enforcement until now. Isaiah listened carefully, elbows on the table, leaning in slightly, not missing a word, while Darius sat beside him, arms folded, making mental notes of every name, every connection, every weakness. Amara stayed quiet but observant, absorbing every detail like she did on missions years ago, because she knew information was ammunition. Meanwhile, Lena remained at the hospital with Malcolm, watching over him in the soft, mechanical rhythm of heart monitors and slow breaths, whispering words to him even though he could not hear, telling him to rest, to hold on, to stay with them just a little longer. Noah watched the coffee shop doors, alert but calm, because he knew Caldwell would be growing desperate by now, and desperate men make reckless decisions. Jasmine continued, showing how Weaver had used her position to approve zoning changes, how Russo purchased properties at drastically undervalued rates after police enforcement cleaned an area, how the city plans had been quietly redrawn to replace family homes with high-end apartments and commercial centers meant for people who did not currently live in these neighborhoods. The Nighthawks did not react loudly. They processed, analyzed, understood. It was Isaiah who finally spoke, his voice low, steady. We need to protect the people they haven't reached yet. And that was when Darius mentioned Deshaun Harris, a local mechanic who owned the last black-owned shop in a stretch of land already marked on redevelopment maps. Deshaun had no idea that the Sentinels were scheduled to make him their next incident, within an hour. The group drove to Deshaun's shop under the soft flicker of streetlights, not to confront, but to prepare. They introduced themselves carefully, showed him only enough proof to be believed. And Deshaun, though shaken, agreed to let them install hidden cameras and audio recorders, trusting them because trust sometimes comes faster when danger is already at the door. They placed cameras beneath shelves, above door frames, inside light casings, quiet and subtle, the kind of preparation that does not interfere with daily life but catches the truth when it happens. Meanwhile, Caldwell was spiraling after the encounter with Noah at Kayla's apartment. Something inside him cracked. Not regret, not remorse, but fear. Fear of consequences, fear of exposure, fear that the system he relied on to protect him was not as bulletproof as he once believed. He drove to a dimly lit parking lot near the river, where Chief Ronald Harper waited inside an unmarked sedan, smoking a cigarette with the casual confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. Caldwell told him the Nighthawks were involved, that they had evidence, that Jasmine Reed was working with them. Harper didn't panic. He simply adjusted his tie and said, "Handle it." But Caldwell's voice broke when he said Malcolm had survived. Harper paused at that, just long enough to reveal something cold and calculating behind his expression, something that showed Malcolm being alive was not part of the plan. He told Caldwell to finish it, meaning eliminate the witness. Caldwell swallowed hard, because murder was a different line than shooting a man and claiming fear, and yet his loyalty, his ambition, and his growing panic tangled together into something dark and unstable. Back at the coffee shop, the Nighthawks and Jasmine reviewed Harper's history. Noticing his rise had been unusually smooth, built on the quiet erasure of complaints and suspiciously timed promotions, Darius leaned back and exhaled slowly, the way a man does when he knows a fight is coming that cannot be avoided. Isaiah looked at each person at the table, and though no one said it aloud, the decision was already made. They were not just gathering evidence anymore. They were preparing to expose the entire structure holding this corruption in place. Jasmine gathered her documents and left through the side door to avoid being seen, and as she walked away, her heartbeat was steady, but her hands trembled slightly, because she knew exposing truth often meant becoming a target herself. The Nighthawks returned to the warehouse where the screens were still glowing with captured footage, and as they reviewed the new files Amara had decrypted, they found what felt like the final thread, a recording from Caldwell's patrol car camera 2 nights before the shooting, where Caldwell asked Harper, "What about the kid?" And Harper replied, "He'll move on." They always do. It was not just corruption, it was cruelty without hesitation. And as the day turned to night, and Memphis rested unaware of the storm building beneath it, the Nighthawks stood together, silent but united, knowing that everything would move quickly now, that the moment to bring the truth into the light was coming, and that once it began, there would be no turning back. Morning rose over the city with a muted heaviness, the kind that settles into the air after a day filled with fear and unanswered questions. And at Methodist University Hospital, the slow rhythm of machines and quiet footsteps formed a fragile cocoon around Malcolm Turner as he lay unconscious, his breathing assisted by tubes that whispered instead of spoke. Lena Ortiz sat beside his bed, still in her scrubs from the night before, her hands folded together, her eyes tired but unbroken, whispering small encouragements every now and then, because sometimes the human voice does more than medicine ever can. She told him his son was safe, that the team was here, that he was not alone and would not be abandoned. She said it with a certainty that came from love, not hope. Meanwhile, Isaiah and Darius waited just outside the room, going over strategy quietly, their tones measured and calm, the way former soldiers do when they understand that the next step must be taken with clarity, not anger. They knew Caldwell would make a move soon, because a man backed into a corner does not become patient. He becomes dangerous. In the parking lot, the sun glared off windshields and ambulance doors as nurses wheeled stretchers, doctors rushed between wings, and ordinary life continued unaware of the tension beneath its surface. Noah monitored the entrance, keeping watch like a sentry, a role he fell back into smoothly, because protecting a brother was something his body remembered even when his heart was heavy with guilt. Jasmine Reed arrived with her camera bag and her notebook, her face drawn not from fear, but from the weight of responsibility, knowing her video of Malcolm's testimony would soon become the turning point of the entire case. She entered the room quietly, where Malcolm remained still, his skin pale, his chest rising and falling with mechanical assistance. Lena adjusted a pillow, brushed Malcolm's hair back gently, then nodded for Jasmine to begin. Jasmine's voice was soft as she spoke into the camera, describing Malcolm's service, his role as a father, his involvement in the community, and the truth of the shooting, her words both factual and deeply human. And then, as if hearing his story called back to him, Malcolm's fingers twitched, slowly, painfully. His eyes opened. There was confusion first, then awareness, then the heavy memory of what had happened. Lena leaned in and said his name softly, and Malcolm blinked once, twice, then breathed a shallow breath that held more determination than strength. Jasmine asked him, gently, if he could describe what happened. And Malcolm nodded, his voice strained but steady as he spoke. He recounted the officer's approach, the tone, the refusal to submit to an unjust search, the sudden flash of violence. His voice cracked only once, when he said, "I just wanted to get breakfast for my son." The recording captured everything, not as drama, but as truth. Jasmine stopped recording and squeezed Malcolm's hand in quiet respect. Meanwhile, outside the hospital, Officer Ethan Caldwell circled the parking lot in his patrol car, his face pale, his jaw clenched tight, the world he had relied on beginning to collapse. He had tried to convince himself that Malcolm wouldn't survive, that the report would hold, that Harper would protect him. But now, fear clung to him like sweat, because he knew what survival meant: evidence, testimony, exposure. He stepped out of the car, scanning the entrance, his hand hovering near his holster, not in defense but in panic. Isaiah spotted him through the glass and motioned to Darius, who followed him outside, moving with quiet control. They approached Caldwell in the parking lot, not aggressively, not with raised voices, but with the calm authority of men who had seen real violence and were not intimidated by a frightened officer. Isaiah held a small recording device in his jacket pocket. Already running, he began speaking evenly, asking Caldwell why the body camera had been disabled, why the shots had been fired, and Caldwell's composure cracked. He tried to justify himself at first, stumbling over explanations, insisting Malcolm was aggressive, that he felt threatened. But when Isaiah mentioned Russo and Weaver by name, Caldwell's face drained of color. He looked around as if someone were listening, as though the world itself might collapse inward. And then, in a moment of unraveling fear, he whispered the truth, fragments of confession spilling out, not complete, not clear, but enough to reveal connection, motive, and coordination. Darius did not speak during the exchange. He simply watched, ensuring Caldwell could not reconstruct his bravado. The recording continued as Caldwell stepped back, realizing he had said too much. His radio crackled with Harper's voice telling him to pull back and regroup. Caldwell didn't respond. He simply walked quickly to his car and drove away, the panic now fully visible. Inside the hospital, Jasmine's video of Malcolm's testimony was uploaded anonymously and released online. It spread faster than rumors, faster than lies, because truth spoken in the voice of the wounded carries weight. People watched, people listened, and then people reacted. The sidewalk outside the hospital filled slowly at first, then rapidly, as members of the community arrived, not with chants or noise, but with quiet presence, standing as witnesses to Malcolm's struggle. The sentinels were prepared to move on the hospital, to intimidate, to silence. But the Nighthawks anticipated this, and before they could act. Amara released the recovered security footage and the patrol car audio logs directly to multiple news outlets and the FBI at the same time, leaving no room for evidence to be suppressed or sanitized. Harper's plan to erase Malcolm and Kayla collapsed in an instant. That morning, the truth became public. That morning, silence ended, and the city of Memphis, still waking, found itself standing at the edge of something it could no longer ignore. By the evening of July 9th, the city had begun to shift, not in loud eruptions, but in the quiet, gathering way a storm develops before it breaks, and outside the Memphis Police Department, people started arriving with signs, photographs, and candles, some still in work uniforms, some carrying children, some simply standing with hands in their pockets, faces set with a steady, grieving anger. The video of Malcolm's testimony, his voice weak but unwavering, had moved through the city like a pulse, waking people who were tired of loss, tired of fear, tired of pretending things were fine. Jasmine Reed stood among them, not holding a sign, not shouting, just documenting, her camera hanging from her shoulder and her notebook open in her hand, capturing the way the crowd grew from dozens to hundreds to thousands in a matter of hours. The Nighthawks observed from nearby, not as leaders or organizers, but as guardians, making sure the protest remained a space of dignity and truth rather than chaos, because they knew that those who benefited from silence would try to turn this moment into something violent to discredit it. Isaiah spoke quietly with Pastor Jeremiah Wells, a respected community leader with a calming presence and a deep, resonant voice that carried across crowds without raising in volume. Pastor Wells stepped onto the low concrete steps of the police headquarters and addressed the gathering, not with rage, but with steady grief, telling the story of Malcolm not as a political symbol, but as a father, a coach, a neighbor, a man who used his strength to protect rather than harm. The crowd listened, not cheering or chanting, but absorbing, the silence itself becoming a statement. Meanwhile, inside the police department, Chief Ronald Harper watched through tinted glass with a tightening jaw, understanding that the narrative was slipping, that the story he had relied on for years, fear, control, justification, was now unraveling, thread by thread. He called the Sentinels to a private meeting, telling them they would move on the protest, escalate it, push the crowd into disorder, force a dispersal that could be blamed on the protesters themselves. But what Harper didn't know was that the Nighthawks were already prepared. Amara and Darius had discreetly set up small, nearly invisible cameras on streetlights, signs, and building awnings surrounding the police headquarters, positioned to capture everything from every angle. They weren't just waiting for evidence. They were waiting for the moment when the truth would reveal itself. As dusk deepened into night, the crowd swelled to more than 5,000 people, standing shoulder to shoulder, singing softly, some humming old church hymns that carried years of resilience within them. Children sat on their parents' shoulders, elderly men leaned on canes, teenagers held hands tightly, and through all of it, Malcolm's name was spoken not as a victim, but as a reminder of how much life mattered. When the first armored police vehicle rolled slowly up the street, people tensed, but did not break. Harper had ordered tear gas to be deployed, to scatter the crowd, to create panic that could be spun as riot behavior. But before the order could be given, Isaiah stepped forward, speaking into a handheld megaphone, his voice low, calm, almost gentle, telling the crowd not to move, not to run, not to give the narrative away. The police line hesitated, because calm in the face of force is disarming in its own way, and just then, something happened that Harper had not anticipated. Caldwell arrived. He did not come in formation or approach the protest line. He walked alone from the side street, his uniform disheveled, his face pale, sweat beading along his hairline, the look of a man who had seen his world collapse and did not yet know what to do with the rubble. The Nighthawks saw him immediately. Jasmine raised her camera. The crowd quieted almost completely, the kind of silence that makes every breath feel loud. Caldwell attempted to speak, his voice cracking, beginning with excuses about pressure, about orders, about not meaning for it to happen, but the words fell apart halfway through. He looked up at the crowd, at faces watching him not with fury, but with an exhausted, deep disappointment. And something inside him broke. He confessed, not cleanly, not in a rehearsed speech, but in fragmented gasps that carried more truth than any polished statement ever could. He admitted the Sentinels had targeted Malcolm. He admitted the body camera had been turned off intentionally. He admitted Harper had given instructions, and that Russo and Weaver had stood to profit. All of this was captured clearly by the cameras Amara and Darius had placed, and Jasmine recorded every word with steady hands. Harper saw it unfolding from the police headquarters window and moved to shut it down, ordering officers to apprehend Caldwell and disperse the protest. But by the time he gave the command, it was too late. The Nighthawks transmitted the footage live to multiple news outlets, uploaded it across mirrored servers, emailed it directly to federal investigators, and projected it onto a nearby building for the entire crowd to see. Harper's own voice from earlier recordings, telling Caldwell to finish it, echoed through the speakers. The crowd did not erupt. They did not charge. They stood still, a wall of witnesses who refused to be erased. And in that moment, the police line faltered. Officers lowered their shields. Some stepped back. Some removed helmets. The protest did not end in violence. It ended in revelation. And as Caldwell was taken into federal custody, tears streaking his face, the power structure that had once seemed unshakable cracked open under the weight of truth, finally given room to breathe. On the morning of July 10th, the Shelby County Courthouse stood under soft, muted daylight, the kind that seems to hesitate before settling, as though the sky itself understood the weight of what was about to unfold inside its walls. The halls were lined with quiet tension, not shouting, not chaos, but the steady hum of anticipation, reporters adjusting microphones, families clutching hands, and officers standing strangely still, uncertain of where loyalty now belonged. Malcolm Turner arrived in a wheelchair, guided gently by Lena and accompanied by Isaiah, Darius, Amara, and Noah, each walking alongside him not as bodyguards but as family forged through shared pain and purpose. Malcolm's face was pale, his breathing still shallow, but his gaze was clear, steady, resolute. He wore no expression of vengeance, no anger burning behind his eyes. Instead, there was something quieter, dignity, the kind that cannot be taught or taken, only lived. Jasmine walked slightly ahead, documenting every detail, her camera capturing the moment Malcolm crossed the threshold into a space long associated with justice that too often failed to deliver it. In another room nearby, Ethan Caldwell sat with his hands cuffed to the table, head bowed. No longer the officer who once walked with swagger, but a man stripped of certainty and identity, caught in a trap of his own making. He looked smaller now, as if the truth had physically carved weight from him. His lawyer murmured quietly, advising him to remain composed, to avoid emotional outbursts, to stick to statements rather than explanations. But Caldwell's composure had cracked days ago, and no legal counsel could restore what had already been undone when he was led into the courtroom. He did not look toward Malcolm, instead. His eyes darted between the floor and the judge's bench, as if searching for something familiar to anchor himself to and finding nothing. Chief Ronald Harper, Councilwoman Diane Weaver, and Vincent Russo were also present, each flanked by attorneys, their expressions severely controlled. Harper's jaw was set with a stubborn defiance, Weaver's hands folded tightly in her lap, and Russo looked as if he had only just begun to comprehend that wealth and status did not guarantee protection. The courtroom filled slowly, the seats occupied by community members, pastors, teachers, students, and neighbors, many of whom had never met Malcolm personally, but felt that his suffering was tied to the suffering of so many before him. When the judge entered, the room rose, and the air thickened with a solemn sense of history turning. The prosecution began with calm clarity, presenting the timeline, then the evidence, Kayla's recording, the restored gas station footage showing Caldwell disabling his body camera before drawing his weapon, the patrol car audio logs in which Caldwell addressed Harper directly, the financial documents linking Weaver and Russo to targeted police actions, and finally, the footage of Caldwell's confession at the protest. Each piece was laid out without embellishment, without dramatic tone, because the truth was powerful enough standing on its own. Caldwell's attorney attempted to argue stress, confusion, fear response, claiming his client had been overwhelmed by perceived danger, but the footage showed no threat, no lunge, no raised voice from Malcolm, only calm refusal to submit to an unlawful search. When the time came for Malcolm to speak, the courtroom held its breath. Lena wheeled him slowly to the witness stand, helping him adjust the microphone, her hand briefly resting on his shoulder. Malcolm looked at Caldwell for the first time, not with fury, but with a heavy sadness. The kind that comes from realizing harm had been done not only to the victim, but to the soul of the one who did it. His voice was quiet, still weakened, but steady. He spoke about his service, about the sacrifices of those who never came home, about the prosthetic leg that reminded him daily of what he had given, not for glory, but for the belief that his country could be better than its flaws. He spoke about Isaiah, about mornings making breakfast, about teaching patience on the baseball field, about promising his son he would always come back. Then he described the shooting, not with dramatic detail, but with simple honesty, the kind that needs no defense. I did not raise my voice. I did not resist. I did not threaten. I only said no to being treated like I was less. The silence that followed carried a weight that pressed into every corner of the room. Caldwell lowered his head and covered his face with one shaking hand, for the first time since the shooting. He cried, not out of empathy, but out of the collapse of the narrative he had held about himself. The judge watched carefully, taking in not only the evidence, but the emotional truth of the testimony, the human cost that could not be measured on paper. The jury deliberated for several hours, though many believed the decision was already clear, and when they returned. The foreman's voice did not waver as he delivered the verdict. Guilty on all major counts: attempted murder, abuse of power, falsification of reports, conspiracy to violate civil rights. Caldwell closed his eyes, a single tear sliding down his cheek, though it did not erase what had been done. Harper was sentenced next, receiving 30 years for orchestrating the conspiracy and directing officers to use violence as a means of community displacement. Weaver received 15 years for corruption and aiding coordinated targeting of neighborhoods. Russo received 22 years for laundering money through redevelopment contracts tied to police enforcement. And Caldwell, once proud of his badge and uniform, received 25 years in federal prison. When the sentencing concluded, Malcolm did not celebrate, he simply exhaled, a long, slow breath that carried months of pain out of his lungs. Isaiah placed a hand on Malcolm's shoulder, their bond unspoken but unbreakable. Caldwell was escorted out, his family absent, his life reduced to a quiet walk down a hallway he could not return from. Outside the courthouse, the crowd stood waiting, not chanting, not shouting, but standing in unity as Malcolm emerged. Some cried, some bowed their heads. Some simply watched with the solemn understanding that justice, though imperfect, had found room to breathe that day, and Malcolm, still exhausted, still healing, lifted his head and met their gaze, not as a symbol, not as a martyr, but as a man who had survived and who had chosen to stand. By November, the heat of summer had long lifted from Memphis, leaving behind cooler air and quieter streets, and in that gentle change of seasons, life began to move forward in ways that were small at first, almost imperceptible, but deeply meaningful. Malcolm Turner was still healing, his body slower than before, his breaths occasionally uneven, but he was alive, and each morning he woke to the sound of his son's footsteps in the kitchen, the soft clatter of cereal bowls, and it felt like a miracle he never took for granted. Isaiah had grown in ways that didn't show in height, but in the steadiness of his voice, the maturity in his eyes, the way he watched his father with a quiet understanding no child should ever have to carry, yet did with grace. Malcolm attended physical therapy 3 times a week, his prosthetic leg and the bullet scars working together like complicated geography. And though some days were harder than others, He faced them without bitterness, because every step now held purpose. With the help of the Nighthawks and several community leaders, Malcolm established a scholarship program, starting small but sincere, aimed at supporting children whose families had been affected by police violence, offering financial aid, counseling, and mentorship, focusing not just on education, but on emotional rebuilding. Donations came slowly at first, then steadily, then all at once after Jasmine Reed published a long-form piece titled "The Man Who Refused to Disappear," which was shared across the country, opening hearts and wallets, transforming the initiative into a $1.5 million fund within weeks. Malcolm did not like the attention, but he accepted it because it meant opportunities for children who had already been asked to grow up far too fast. Meanwhile, the Nighthawks did not disband. They could have returned to their separate lives, gone back to careers and routines, told themselves they had done their part. But they each understood something now that could not be forgotten. Malcolm's case was not an isolated tragedy, but a visible thread connected to many others, and cutting that thread required more than justice in a single courtroom. The FBI approached Isaiah with a proposal to form a task force specializing in uncovering networks of corruption tied to redevelopment and policing across the country. And though the work promised exhaustion, risk, and an unending uphill climb, Isaiah accepted without hesitation. Amara became the lead technical investigator. Darius took on field operations coordination. Lena continued her medical work but remained on call as a consultant. And Noah, who had carried the guilt of proximity to Malcolm's shooting for so long, finally found a way to transform that weight into something constructive, helping the task force build trust with communities who had every reason to be distrustful. Together, they operated not as vigilantes but as official partners in a federal effort to expose systemic abuse, carrying with them a discipline learned long before any of this had begun. Jasmine received recognition for her reporting, invited to speak at universities and press conferences, but she always redirected praise back to Malcolm, to Kayla, to the community, to the voices that mattered most. Kayla, who once trembled holding her phone while recording the shooting, now stood confidently behind podiums in gymnasiums and town halls, speaking about moral courage and conscience, her voice no longer shaking, because she had learned that bravery did not mean fearlessness, but choosing truth despite fear. And Caldwell, Harper, Weaver, and Russo served their sentences, their names no longer spoken with authority but remembered as warnings of what power becomes when it rots from within. On a crisp November afternoon, the Fraser Community Center held a ceremony, simple but full of meaning, where families gathered, students played music, and a small stage was set up under warm lights. Malcolm sat near the front, bundled in a coat, his breathing steady, Isaiah beside him, their hands resting on the same armrest, a quiet connection shared without words. Pastor Wells opened the event with a prayer that was not about victory or defeat, but about healing, about acknowledging the pain of what had happened while also recognizing the profound resilience that had followed. One by one, community members spoke, sharing memories of how Malcolm had taught their children patience, how he had listened when others did not, how his survival had become a symbol not of suffering, but of determination. Then Jasmine introduced Isaiah, who walked to the microphone slowly, his small hands gripping the edge of the podium. He looked out at the crowd, his father, the Nighthawks, and the people who had gathered not to mourn but to honor. His voice was soft but clear as he spoke about the morning his father had left to get him breakfast, how the days that followed had been confusing and frightening, how he had learned that strength was not about fighting but about standing firm in truth even when the world tried to knock you down. "My dad didn't choose to be a hero," he said. "He chose to be a good man, and that is harder." The room was quiet, not because the words were dramatic, but because they were deeply, achingly real. Malcolm blinked back tears, not from pain, but from pride. From the profound relief of having lived to hear his son speak those words. When applause rose. It was not loud or explosive. It was warm, steady, like hands supporting rather than celebrating. After the ceremony, the Nighthawks stood together outside under a pale evening sky, and for the first time in a long time, there was no urgency pressing them forward, only quiet companionship. They talked about work ahead, yes, but also about birthdays, about children, about the mundane details of living that feel precious once nearly lost. Malcolm looked at them and knew, without speech or grand declarations, that their bond had shifted into something permanent. As the crowd dispersed and lights dimmed, Malcolm placed a hand gently on Isaiah's shoulder, and the two of them stood facing the community center, feeling the stillness of the moment. Life had not returned to what it was before. It never would, but it had continued, and it had done so with purpose. The story did not end with violence or with vengeance, but with a promise carried forward by every person who refused to let silence bury truth again. Because justice, Malcolm realized, was not a verdict or a sentence. It was a commitment, one made daily, quietly, steadily, by those who choose to care when it would be easier not to. And he chose it. Again. And again. Thank you for watching. If this story meant something to you, please subscribe and leave a like to support the channel.